We fight at the dinner table.
So you don't have to. I'm
I'm
Eric.
Aurora,
Oh no, we fucked it up.
and I'm Aurora,
We're cousins.
and we disagree amicably.
All right. So here we are. This is kind of our horror month. We decided to talk about kind of H.P. Lovecraft inspired stuff with a few other things because I love H.P. Lovecraft. I think it's great. So we decided to watch In the Mouth of Madness, which is inspired by H.P. Lovecraft. And then this week we're going to be talking about some of his more popular short stories, which are Call of Cthulhu, The Dunwich Horror, and At the Mountains of Madness. At the Mountain of Madness.
I have listened to like 10 hours of H.P. Lovecraft, so let's
Only
let's
10.
discuss. But first, I
Only
have a
10.
question. I have a question.
Okay, what's your question?
It's it's not exactly related to this. If there was a restaurant and you knew they had a cockroach infestation, would you still eat there? If the food was super good, like it was your favorite food ever.
This is kind of a weird question for H.P. Lovecraft, but I mean,
It's
I've eaten at some pretty shady spots that are delicious. Sometimes you just grab your food and go, I didn't see anything. All right, let's get out of here.
okay, so you don't like check your food for bugs or anything like that.
Well, I would hope that the food preparation area is clear.
Okay. See, this is I think the difference between us.
Okay. Okay.
Well, because I was reading Call of Cthulhu, and do you know which of his stories that you like notice more of his racism in?
Uh, I mean, there's racism in most of his well, in a lot of his stories.
So you can tell when
Oh
he's like
yeah, yeah.
being
There's
weird.
there's there's definitely some in there. I mean, you just kind of go, all right, this was like 100 and some years ago. Deerfin, that was not uncommon, but you
It
just
was
kind of
more
gotta,
acceptable then. It
yeah.
was
You
more
can't
common.
just be like, you can't look at old works through the current lens of today, and you just gotta kind of take it with a grain of salt and just say, yeah, okay, he might have been a little racist. Fine. That doesn't mean I'm racist for reading it, right? I feel like we get in that kind of trap of, oh, well, he was a raging racist, so I can't support him. It's like he's been dead for like 100 years.
Right.
clear,
You
clear,
reading the
Jeff.
work doesn't
This
give
is,
him any money. There's a
yeah,
difference between
this,
death of the author when an author is dead and death of an author when an author is actively profiting from your support.
yeah, this stuff is all literally public domain at this point. So, you know, just read the stories for what they are. Enjoy the world building because that's what I think H.P. Lovecraft does really well is world building, and that kind of goes into why I like. And I know this one's probably your least favorite. Uh, at the Mountains of Madness.
I actually thought that the world building was interesting in it. It's just that it's more sci-fi than it is horror. And I kind of was expecting to experience horror, but every single book that I read of his is just some guy like freaking himself out.
Um, a lot of them are, yeah. I think the Dunwich
Well,
horror is written in the third person perspective, and it's kind of more like taking you on the journey of what's going on and from an outside perspective. And he does a good job of kind of flipping his normal kind of script, which is yeah, usually it's one person either exploring or finding out kind of his journey, um, like discovering the cult, like a cult or
Oh, so this is his specific voice that you're talking about, is the first person kind of scribbling account type of
Yeah.
voice. Because I was like looking for it and I'm like, he says decadent a lot.
Well, I will say this: it is kind of his writing style is kind of hard to get into at first. It's very jarring because it's kind of like old timey descriptions, and he's very descriptive. And instead of just saying like, "Oh, he died," he has to go, "Oh, the death acquired via the exhalation of film." A lot of
Oh,
descriptive words.
that wasn't the part that bothered me at all. I was just like, when he glazes over, it's like, I'm not going to tell you how bad it was, but it was just like undulating horror. And I'm just like, okay, what kind of undulating horror? Like, I
Well,
would like to experience some horror, please. And it is just,
okay. So here's something. Sometimes, in order for horror to work, the reader needs to fill in the blanks, and I think he does a good enough because he could obviously go into it, but the true horror is you projecting your own like worst case scenario onto the situation, if that makes sense.
I feel like this must be I must be like very, like, not creative in this field because I'm just like, okay. And like, I just don't, my, my fear-based imagination is not that mystical. My fear-based imagination is based on like very real things that happen to me. So it's like the escapism of cosmic horror. I don't have the neuron receptors needed for that to like work for me, I think. Because I'm just like, and what's so scary about the dark ones just waiting and whispering to you? Do you not? What's so bad about that?
Well, okay. So let's talk about At the Mountains of Madness, right? So real quick summary for people who don't know or who may be going into this like, "Oh, what are they talking about?" So it's this expedition discovers a mountain range higher than the Himalayas at the like Arctic Circle. Uh, so they think, oh, cool, we're gonna go explore this place. This is a huge deal. Let's go figure out what's going on. So it kind of goes through their expedition, and then there's like three little groups, and then one of the groups finds a ancient city older than anything ever on Earth discovered. We'll put it that way.
Yeah.
And he's, this is the 19 what 20s, so there isn't like, oh, let's just FaceTime and show them what we got, modern cameras, so they have to like wire each other. There's some communication, but it's very sporadic, so it
I mean,
kind of,
even now, communication to certain areas is very difficult without satellite, etc., because it
yeah.
doesn't have the infrastructure. It's not instantaneous. It is still perilous. Antarctica and even some areas of the Appalachian Mountains, like, it would still be, I
Oh
kind of
yeah.
feel like it's still possible today for that. If you go hiking in remote areas, you don't get cell reception. So even I feel like that is still works,
So
the communication
yeah.
isolation aspect.
Yeah. So they're basically isolated, and then one of the groups says, "Oh my gosh, we found this discovery. This will blow the lid off everything we know about our world." And then they're writing each other back, or uh, radioing each other at this point because they're radioing, and then they lose contact with the party, completely lose contact. So then they go. The other group of people are like, "Oh my gosh, what just happened? We got to go figure it out." And they discover basically an ancient city of the old ones, and it's been dormant for probably as long as humans have been around, if not longer. I mean, they talk about finding bones of ancient animals back when it was a tropical paradise. And they kind of go through like, oh, what was it? They look like pictographs depicting the story of kind of the old ones, and then it kind of goes in.
Well, they explain these sculptural murals unlike
Yeah,
anything we've ever seen, but sculptural murals are called frescoes. They existed by the Etruscans before ancient Rome took over. So I was just kind of confused. Like maybe it's like, oh, these are just so detailed, like so lifelike, so something else. And maybe there is just some certain level of artisticness that exists that could not be perceived or could not be expressed. But I was just like, I don't get it. Are they frescoes? Like, is that, I don't know. Like, I thought it was cool. I thought, oh, hey, like frescoes and how they had all of their furniture in the middle of the room so that they could just like spend all their time making frescoes for funds. Like, that's cool. But I don't know. Was I supposed to experience horror from that? Like, I was supposed to be like, oh, cool.
well, no, that's not really. So this one I feel like fleshes out a lot of. Uh,
Lore?
it's yeah. So it's hard because so at this point he's written about the old ones. How should I explain this? So they're all novelettas, right? They're all kind of short stories, but they're all kind of linked in a way with the bigger context, like the lore of the old ones. You have Cthulhu in some of these with people going mad, and he brings in like the Necronomicon, right? And he is the person who invented what the Necronomicon is, too. So you
Yeah.
see all these kind of things, and they're all kind of linked. So he talks about the Mad Arab Azul, who wrote the Necronomicon, and that is very prevalent in a lot of his stories, right? So this is kind of giving kind of like a history of a lot of this stuff, where it says where they came from. So the city is depicting in these pictographs or whatever you called it. And I mean, you kind of got to assume that these guys are from a college, probably professors or students who are intimately familiar with this kind of study and research. So they could probably figure out what the pictographs are fairly quickly.
So I think what it is to me is that a lot of his stories are kind of the author retroactively describing going crazy. He's like, well, I didn't think anything about it, but like this became important later, blah, blah, blah. And I think something that the movie did into the Mountain of Madness was it grounded the character as the main character as a very realistic, rational character and his stuff. Because I feel like H.P. Lovecraft's characters, we don't get this solid feeling of who this guy is before he has been driven somewhat insane by this knowledge of cosmic horrors untold. And that I think is one of the kind of pitfalls is that you can't see the character losing their rationality gradually to the same degree, I feel.
Yeah, I can kind of in these stories, yes. So there is some other ones where you do see people kind of go into that madness. These are just some of the more popular ones that we picked. If you were to explore his whole catalog, I'm sure you'll find a few more like that. I think
Well,
the
this is
Reanimator is kind of one of those too, where it does that.
uh you know, I did just finish the Reanimator, and you know what it reminds me of?
What?
Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I just read a book that was inspired by it recently, so it
Yeah.
came up to mind immediately. Do you know when Frankenstein was written?
Oh gosh, what, the 1800s?
Yeah, it was. 1818.
Yeah, most
Like a
definitely.
hundred, like it was 100 years earlier. So I don't know. I feel like there are some things that he did that are interesting, but I feel like he's just like a point in time and he's used as a reference point to kind of explain people's influences and stuff like that. Because I feel like, for example, Cthulhu and this idea of cephalopods, the Kraken has existed for as folk tales for a long time. Like maybe that's where he got this inspiration from and why he's using these un old beings or you can I'm sure you know which the name is for these creatures that have
Old ones.
lived in the ocean.
I think, if I remember correctly, most of his like writing came from his dreams and nightmares.
Interesting.
So yeah, personal experiences and neuroses. So he wrote about kind of like his own fears and that kind of stuff. Uh, One thing I did see was he was actually an atheist, and he didn't believe in like the traditional good versus evil type story, right? So a lot
Interesting.
of stories are like, oh, I'm fighting off demons, or I'm using the God's will to protect me. Kind of like that more traditional type
Yeah, he
good
has a
versus
lot of
evil.
God and unholiness and devil's child type descriptors. So that's really
Well,
interesting to know that.
well, I think from what I remember reading and kind of looking into this, it's he found it more terrifying that humans could forsake humans, if that makes sense. So, you have these cults, and the cults are basically trying to awaken Cthulhu, and then once like Cthulhu awakens, it's boom, end of the world,
Right.
apocalypse. So he finds it more terrifying that people would forsake other people than, oh, I'm being possessed by a demon, or oh, you
I
know,
see. So
g-
so
you
it's
know,
more about the betrayal kind of
yeah, yeah.
than the
And he thought that was more interesting storytelling than like I said, the traditional kind of thing.
I think that's true. It is more interesting because I felt like in his in the Dunwich horror, they kind of explain this well,
Well,
it's
okay.
not exactly a demon child, but it kind of feels very familiar
Ah,
to
yes.
that kind of mythology almost.
So, do you want to give a quick summary of the Dunwich horror?
The Dunwich horror is a kind of small, isolated town, and he kind of explains them as both decadent and kind of culty and weird and kind of doesn't like outsiders but has weird stuff happen to them and a
So, this is the town, right? So, the town. I'll kind of explain some other stuff that I know from the story, but keep
so the
going.
town is already this kind of weird town that's isolated and this woman is and her father live on the outskirts of this town and they say on the night of one of these
Black
things
Sabbath kind of things. Yeah.
one of these celebrations, she became impregnated and she gave birth to this sort of unholy child who kind of just came across as just off and goaty to people. And it grew unnaturally fast and its voice sounds like a little bit weird, like it has voice, uh, like vocal cords that it isn't meant to have, kind of. And it's very unnatural. And the father of this woman who gave birth to these children has all these demon summoning type books, and he's doing all these different suspicious things and all this and that.
They literally call him a wizard.
And so they go into it, and are we spoiling it or are we just giving the premise? I'm asking Eric, should we spoil it or should we give them, or are we just explaining the premise?
You could spoil it. It's been around for 100 years, but like in the book, they literally call this guy a wizard too.
So there he's also sacrificing cattle and all kinds of other stuff that people just don't know what's going on with them. And the father passes away, and throughout this time, people have been blaming them for the disappearance of youth and dogs, and they kind of pay them off with physical, old-timey like gold that's confusing. And even his mother eventually is afraid of him, and they suspect that he kills her.
Yeah.
The climax of the story is that there is a specific book he needs to find to theoretically bring these other beings into the world and unleash, the apocalypse upon everybody. And these three professors, one professor kind of gets a bad feeling about it and kind of like refuses to do so. And upon him, the son, the unholy son, trying to sneak in and get the book and steal it, he gets kind of bitten by a dog. I didn't understand how he was like somehow killed by this dog. That didn't, which who all dogs hate this guy, this child, by the way. That
Yeah.
was mentioned a lot.
It was foreshadowing, right?
Is it? Because I was just like, well, if this guy thing keeps killing dogs that hate him, because it, or is it just that he was killing all of these humans, but he had like the vital weakness of dogs? Like I was really confused about how he just got bitten to death by a dog when he was just this ungodly being. I was really anyways,
I mean, he
but
wasn't necessarily a ungodly being, but yes, he I don't know, was it's just a way for him to get killed off to
so he
prevent the
gets
apocalypse.
he gets killed off, and they discover that he the only parts of him that really looked human were his face and hands, and he was kind of just like this weird tentacled hairy thing that was extremely buttoned up and could only look human within the most generous of clothing covering him. And soon after he dies, he almost like just melts into like a whitish glue. But there's this thing that he had been feeding at home this whole time.
Well,
And it kind of just
one thing too,
expands.
before you give away the ending, one thing too in the book was like they talked about who was his father because nobody really knew who his father was, and it was kind of a mystery. And so going into the ending, um, right, you find out that yes, there was this other thing that he was feeding, and it was kind of growing out of control, and it was actually his brother.
That was a great twist ending, though.
And it looked more akin to his quote unquote father than he did. So his father was more of this tentacly beast creature monster, um, old one spawn, I guess you could call it.
Well, they were like not of this dimension.
Yeah.
But in the mountain of madness, the old ones are corporeal, and it was the other beings that were not corporeal, that were from another dimension.
It's complicated his history, and I'm sure you could go watch like summaries. There's like 5 hour summaries of all this stuff too, of the
Jeez,
greater
5 hours
lore.
for a summary. This is so much. Okay.
Well, it's
But
just like lore. I mean, any big property, has lots of
Yes,
lore,
lots of lore.
and it pulls from a lot of different books too. So, and you kind of got to piece everything together to get the bigger picture.
I think his was originally published as like magazine articles, and I think that's like a better way to read it than trying to like do it all at once
Yeah,
because if you try to get a huge part of it all at once, it kind of feels very repetitive and also it has these kind of inconsistencies in between. Which is if you're reading it as like this part of the story comes out and it kind of gives you summaries of the earliest story within it when the like new issue of the magazine comes out. So it's really the format that you need to read it in because reading it as like a huge compendium all at once is it's just not the right format for it, I think. Because it is like so repetitive, it reminds you over and over again of what the rest of the story just happened was. So it it's good for like short stories that you read just randomly throughout the time, but not all at once.
yeah. So funny, I believe he got started because so okay, he was interested in it was called weird fiction. So it's kind of like a little bit more than just the like fantasy type things. Like you said, the one of the stories kind of felt more science fictiony, right?
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's kind of he did a lot of science fiction, horror, cosmic horror, which actually was invented after his. And I believe he wrote the magazine, and he said, "Your stories are garbage. Here is a better one. Publish it." And they went, "Well, that's actually pretty good." And from what I read, it he wasn't super popular at first, but as his body of work grew and people discovered it, I would say like after his lifetime. And then they come to realize, wow, this is actually really good stuff. This is really fleshed out. You know, you read a few of them, they all kind of tie together loosely. You know, it's kind of that world building.
So you enjoy the science fiction world building aspect of it, right?
Oh, yeah, I think it's great.
So is that part of the major appeal? Because you really enjoy science fiction in general. So,
Well, I like the science fiction horror aspect of it because it's not just strictly science fiction. Like, let's talk about since we're kind of moving on. I did like the Dunwich horror. I think that's a good kind of more traditional horror-y kind of book, right?
it very much reminded me of like Antichrist type stories. And I couldn't tell if that was because we base a lot of Antichrist stories on a format that he created or if he's just using that same format.
I don't know. That's a good question. I couldn't tell you the like facts on that, but given that it so well, I mean, even look at the story, right? He kind of the girl who got pregnant with this abomination was told she's an albino, so she has super pale skin. That's kind of, what is pale skin is seen as quote pure, but then you kind of have the next level, which is albinoism, which is kind of seen as an abomination of that, right?
Yeah, I did think that was interesting. I didn't know exactly what he was trying to say with that. I was just like,
Well, like I said, it's kind of the if somebody is fair of skin, right? They're seen as very pure. So it's the corruption of the pureness.
I see. So you think it is a discussion of the corruption of pureness is like part of the allegory.
I would say part of it, maybe just a comment on it, but yeah. But you have this town, right? And they said that there's ruins, and the land is literally blighted because of these lands, right? Nothing really grows there. Even the people are kind of ugly and gross, you know? And that just shows that these, because again, the ruins are obviously an old one, ancient city, or what, a remnants of it, or something, right? And they still affect the land that it's near. I don't
Mhm.
know if you got that part or kind of remember that.
I did I did not get that part. I just got that people were weird and I thought it was the Dunwich horror of this abomination, like this blob that expanded that was causing the blight
No, it's actually the area itself that was
is
the
already
issue. Is
blighted.
already blighted, and because um, oh, I should explain this. So because the area was blighted, that attracted the father character. I can't remember his name, but they literally called him a wizard too, right?
Mhm.
To this area because he the book they're referring to is obviously the Necronomicon. I can't remember if it said that outright or if it just kind of like alluded to it.
I think that it was alluded to. I don't think they said it out directly.
Yeah, because so the Necronomicon, if you're unaware, in his world building writing is done by the Mad Arab, and it basically is a how-to guide to uh, perform rituals to summon the old ones, if that makes sense.
Right, it has
And
like the
other,
different chantings and
yeah,
all that kind of stuff
yeah,
like
and
that.
other unspeakable things too. So, and there's like a whole history to it. Actually, I think there's a story literally said the history of the Necronomicon. So he's trying to get this in order to, because this area is blighted. Obviously, it might have an old one or is linked to an old one somehow to perform this ritual, right?
I see.
But yeah, I did like how the ending you find out that this abomination creature blob thing was actually technically his brother, so he was actually a twin.
Yeah, the twin thing was a interesting thing because I thought it was like his father that they were like kind of hiding or something like that. But it was his father was from a different dimension, and so he and his brother are only kind of partially tied to this dimension by their humanness, but very, very barely.
Yeah,
I feel like the Call of the Cthulhu was a perfect entry point.
it is. It's it kind of gives a good cross section of his writing, if that makes sense. So it kind of, you have the different chapters, right? So what, chapter one, you kind of explore, this guy discovering this box that his uncle gave him when he passed away, and then he's like, "Oh well, whatever. It's locked. I can't unlock it." So he finally unlocks it, and he discovers all this research into this cult and these weird dreams and all this kind of weird, crazy stuff, right?
Hmm.
And then he starts investigating it, right? Which is kind of chapter two, if you remember, where he starts looking into it. He tries to go figure out what's going on. We kind of get a little bit more of the history of these with a this event, this some sort of weird event that happened all across the world where people went into like hysteria, right? Do you remember that?
Yes. Well, it kind of seemed like he was tying like a bunch of different cults into the same thing at the same time too. Like it was like
Hmm.
there was this cult of Cthulhu and this other cult of Cthulhu and these people dying. And I feel like the Call of Cthulhu is the perfect entry point, and it also is of the like of the stories that I've read, it's the one where he like comments the most on like race, where it's like specifically like the mixed people are more susceptible to the Call of Cthulhu and like are more like out to get him. It was like really weird, honestly. It was like these men had mixed backgrounds, blah blah blah, something something, and I was like, what is that even
Yeah,
relevant to? Like what?
yeah, that's all right.
Like it was like so bizarre to me that I was just like, damn, like what? Like what was he trying to say with that? Was he trying to say that it was because to me, his constant commentary on that gave me this like weird impression of somebody frightened of all other faiths, and that he was just like making it up more because it was this like character that was like so scared of the other, and this idea of like other people worshiping other things, because there's this huge like, even though he technically might have been an atheist, he and in the in the reanimation, he kind of talks about being like more of a materialist, so like even wondering if there even is a soul. But there's such huge Christian overtones to like everything that it's like really heavy-handed, I feel, in a lot of this stuff. So it's like how much of this is actually scary and how much of this is just like a cult-like fear of the other.
Well, you know, he might be kind of commenting that like religion is like this cult.
Oh, okay. So you think it wasn't that he was trying to say that it was about other, he just thinks like all religion are these kind of weird
Maybe.
types of things.
But the story goes on. So, you know, and then we get the first person account of the sailor who encountered Cthulhu and the city, right? That rose from the sea, and then they go exploring it, and then a few people die of fright because they literally see, or they just die. They probably just went, I can't handle it, heart attack or whatever. And then the rest of them flee, right? And only what, two people made it out back to the boat because, like I said, they ran aboard, were curious, went out, saw this thing, basically saw Cthulhu,
I
ran
think
back
to
to their
me, what
yeah.
the the part of the story that stood out to me was this sculptor, and he would have these dreams, and his uncle was interviewing the sculptor about his dreams. And then this sculptor makes this like magnificent statue basically depicting Cthulhu with such immense detail. And that even though he doesn't remember it at all, like he just basically stopped getting these dreams and he seemed to not remember anything of that he was telling the uncle about.
Oh,
He kind of is still affected by it in all of his art, like you can tell.
yeah. So, well, that's the interesting part. So, what had happened was these guys accidentally woke up Cthulhu because they entered his domain, and they only woke him up for like a split second, but it was enough that the entire world experienced this madness, right? Where it affected artists' dreams, and you go back to the sculptor, and I think they what they do is they take their boat and try and ram into him, and then he goes back to he basically takes this city that rose from the depths of the sea, and it basically sinks back down, and Cthulhu goes back to sleep. But just the fact that Cthulhu woke up for like a minute made people go mad across the earth. This whole giant event that this guy is investigating happened because of this.
Well,
And
but
he,
like the sculpture goes back to normal. He's kind of fine. I just didn't understand what was so scary. It was like, okay,
well,
everybody
no, no,
went
it's
mad at
just,
the same time.
yeah, no, it's just because. So the freaky part is that Cthulhu holds so much power and is so influential over people that literally him waking up for a split second, a minute, made tons of people go mad for that amount of time, right? And then he goes back to sleep, and then people kind of return back to normal, but they're still affected by it even after the fact.
Maybe. Okay,
No?
so I mean, sure. I think the only part, so Call of Cthulhu also was the only one that had just one thing that did actually I considered like, oh, that gives me the chills. But it wasn't in empathy with humans. It was these old ones, right? They exist never dying and they're frozen. And they are kind of waiting for their god Cthulhu to come back. But
Well,
they have to,
there's a
and they whisper,
yeah,
sorry.
there's a few different gods and old ones and whatnot.
Well,
Cthulhu is just
it
one of
was,
them. He's not
it
technically the
was,
god of all of them.
but in the Call of Cthulhu, they explain that there are these quote unquote old ones that are
Yes.
undying that who worship Cthulhu and they're kind of encased in stone, but they're alive, fully present, noticing every minute, unable to move or speak for eons.
Yeah.
That gave me the chills because I not being able to move or speak for eons and being fully present the entire time, to me, that is the horrific part. So instead of being scared of them, it's just like the empathy I experience for these old ones. And I'm like, damn, like I'd be whispering in people's dreams too.
Oh my gosh. That explains everything. You'd be one of the cultists.
Yes, exactly. That is the thing, is that to me, his like in a lot of it, it's kind of like framed as the other. It was just like to me, I feel like to him I would be other. So I'm not scared of this other that he's so scared of, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think what kind of where the horror comes from and some of the things it's cosmic indifference, I think is what it's called, where basically no matter what you do, no matter how you live your life, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't matter. You don't matter. And that's
Oh, I
scary for a
see.
lot of people, right? And that's kind of where this comes from. It's no matter what you do, no matter how you do it, this isn't like Independence Day where you can go and defeat the aliens, because of willpower and a good talk and motivation, right?
So I can understand that kind of horror in that it can affect this kind of like existential dread in people. However, in all of his stories, they managed to avert disaster.
Well, kind of. So in Call of Cthulhu, it's not so much they stopped the horror. It's the horror woke up, went meh, and then went back to sleep.
So the scary part is what if he wakes up for good next
Yes,
time?
yeah. It's not necessarily the Dunwich horror. Granted, he does kind of get stopped, but it's of kind of his own fault. Um, and in the mountains at oh my gosh, at the
At the
mountain
Mountain of Madness.
of madness, I got it. It's discovering the city, and then as you remember the ending where they basically are leaving and they see this whole city and kind of get a glimpse of something underneath it,
Vaguely.
and then they basically warn never to go there. because
Yes.
they get chased off by a shuggoth, which we didn't really talk about either.
Yeah, because I'm not really good with all that name stuff. Like they were the Shoggoth are like monsters kind of bred by the old ones in the Mountains of
Yes,
Madness for reasons.
well, because they need basically people to do their bidding and be uh, crazy monster things that just do whatever the old ones need them to do, like maintain a city that's been dead for eons.
So here's the thing is we like okay, so even if Cthulhu does wake up, like is he gonna wake up again in my lifetime? Because like that's not an immediate threat, you know? And
So here's the thing. So yes, there technically is ways per the like the Necronomicon of waking him up, right? And that's kind of where the cults come into play. So it's a lot of times in the stories or some of the stories, it's like somebody versus the cultists. Maybe not so overtly in his
well, it
stories.
was like these good and rational anthropologists versus these ungodly heathens.
So
That's like the no, that's like the kind of what all of his stories boil down to, right?
no, the
No?
reanimator is not like that at all.
Right. The reanimator is I am an ungodly heathen. I mean, I thought that his like description of the doctor in the reanimator kind of getting more and more twisted was on the more interesting side
Yeah.
of
No,
that.
that's another one. Well, that's kind of why I like his stories too, because they're not all just the same, right? Not everything is just, oh, the old ones. Oh, this guy goes crazy. Oh, we're done. So, since I wasn't, I didn't read the Reanimator because I didn't think we were gonna get that many
Well,
in.
no, I definitely the Necronomicon when you wanted me to read it, I put it on hold at the library and it just became available today. So I was like, I might as well just listen to it because, it's it's here.
Fair enough.
So, uh I just I wanted to kind of get a good sense of like what H.P. Lovecraft, was about. I just I kind of like I wanted to understand because I feel like he's I had a friend who just like really likes the iconography of it because he just really likes like cellulopods. And I think like just the aesthetic is its own thing.
Oh yeah, it's what like kind of H.G. Geiger. No, H.R. Geiger. Yeah, if you're familiar with H.R. Geiger, basically the Alien, he did the Alien movies, was the creative director for that. He's a super famous, really like the best way I can describe it is wet and creepy art, mildly phallic a lot of times.
Okay.
He did the design of the Alien for Aliens and Alien for all of those pretty much, and the like set design where you just see like spines and like just weird unnerving sets. That's all
Yeah.
his kind of inspiration. So that kind of is reminiscent of like these amorphic blobs of shifting like teeth and tentacles and all kinds of weird stuff, right?
Yeah.
Which kind of goes into the what how kind of H.P. Lovecraft describes some of his stuff.
Right. And what's interesting about a lot of it is, for example, in the Mountain of Madness, he explains these old ones as basically almost like vegetable Like they're they're basically like they like recreate through spores. They're kind of more vegetable based. And then there are other cosmic beings that are like interdimensional. And
Yeah.
then there's so and so there's this like lack of mammalian skeleton in a lot of these beings that gives us the kind of creeps, especially when you go into the ocean and stuff, the like ocean aspect of stuff, because for example, octopi live in the ocean and they kind of can undulate and exist without a real skeleton except for its beak. And we don't live in the water, we live on land, so we have our skeleton, our mammalian, and everything that's good and right to us is very mammalian. But an an octopus and squid are just such a different entity to us that we cannot imagine that way of being. But octopi are like incredibly intelligent.
Oh yeah.
And so there's something very creepy to us because it exists so different from the way that we exist. So I think that the kind of just this existence is like the interesting thing. Like I feel like if I were to see a like writhing mass of like eyes and mouths and like slimy tentacles, like I'm sure I would be like more viscally grossed out. But reading it, like listening to the audiobook or reading about it doesn't seem to like hit the same as like an actual visual or like being in person. Cause like I've scared myself more like with a shadow that looked like a claw on my wall.
Really?
Yeah, this is like 10 years ago, and I was like at home alone, and there was just like this creepy tree branch that looked like a shadow, like right above my bed. It looked like a claw grabbing at me, and I like freaked myself out.
That's too funny. But yeah, that's kind of where I like the horror, right? Aspect of it. It's you kind of project. I mean, obviously you don't, but the
That
idea
I think, yeah,
is for you to project your own fears on what these things may look like or are versus him going into great detail describing it. Because if he goes into great detail describing it, boom, that's it. Okay, you
was
know
just a
what it
thing,
looks like.
right? Yeah.
Oh yeah,
The
it's
more
just
you
okay.
describe it, the more it's just like, oh well, it's just a composite creature, right? Like when he
Yeah,
explains Cthulhu as like this man with an octopus face and like dragon wings, and then this other being as like a starfish face being, and I'm like, okay, sure. Octopus composite, like ocean composite beings, very creepy. Like, gotcha. It definitely like lessens it, and then you get into like the Rule 34 aspect of things, which is just a whole nother thing.
well, yeah, that's more a modern thing than
I mean,
anything.
that's very true, but like once the internet has existed, it has trivialized everything.
Pretty much.
Like nothing is real and nothing matters once you have the internet. Everything that was like a sacred fear is now ridiculed when
Or
because of the internet.
sexualized.
Well, is it not ridiculed by being sexualized?
I mean, that's it's. I don't really think that's ridicule type thing. I think that's a different kind of. Anyway,
Ah, I see. I
but
think my interpretation is very different just because like I do not understand the idea of sexualizing things.
fair
So to
enough.
me, it can only be interpreted as ridicule.
All right. Since you've read all these books or the short stories, would you recommend these to people who don't know of Call of Cthulhu, At the Mountains of Madness, Dunwich Horror? Would you recommend these stories? Would you recommend some other stories? Because I know you've read a few of them at this point.
So personally, I don't feel like Lovecraft is worth the time investment for pure enjoyment. If you Lovecraft has done more for the canon. I think the idea that Lovecraft has introduced, people who are inspired by him, I think have done more to introduce interesting works that people can enjoy. However, if you do want to know what Lovecraft is about, I think Call of Cthulhu is a good example of it, and you get a kind of a great distillation of what his stuff is about. And personally, I have a different story of his that I personally enjoyed that was his favorite of mine that I would recommend. in the big picture, but ultimately what boils down to it is I don't really think Lovecraft is worth it to read if you like. There's a lot of eldritch horror, there's a lot of cosmic horror that's out there, but he is a huge time investment, even though his short stories do kind of go very fast.
Yeah. So I'm
But
shocked.
if you wanted to do one,
I don't know
I
what
do
to say.
think if you wanted to know what Lovecraft was about, I think Call of Cthulhu is probably the best example of it. But I know that you personally really enjoy Lovecraft. Is there
Yeah.
one?
Uh,
Um, I think you personally recommended Call of Cthulhu
yeah,
to me
I
for that reason, right?
yeah, so I recommended Call of Cthulhu because that's kind of I feel one of the best stories and that kind of gives his A style of writing, B his narrative type stuff because a lot of the narratives are kind of similar, right? Even though they're different people, different settings, and different, we'll say, bigger monsters or monsters, it's all kind of the same trope, you could say, right? Where it's a person kind of discovering things, uh, pieces of a bigger puzzle, if that makes sense, and starting to put those pieces together. And I feel Call of Cthulhu is pretty much the good entry point to that, and it's a story that stands on its own. So you
Yeah, I
can,
could see how it stands on its own. Yeah.
so if you like that kind of story, and if you enjoy Call of Cthulhu, maybe check out some of his other stuff. That's why, like, the Dunwich horror is a good one too, because it's a little bit different, but still kind of similar. Is that similar vein, if that makes sense? And then from there, you can go to like At the Mountains of Madness, where it kind of goes into a different direction completely, but it's still kind of the same format, if that makes sense.
I think At the Mountains of Madness really goes into the lore, and that's partially why you enjoy it, but it kind of ends up being much more sci-fi and talking about these space battles and stuff like this. I like the idea of it being as an anthropological dig,
Got it.
but I think that my interest in anthropology is almost different from this.
You're more interested in the real life type stuff.
Well, I think that, we talked about this, like what I like, because you really like this guy's narrative perspective. You think that it it could almost be real, right? It's like this guy is going on an anthropological dig and then subtly they become more and more deranged because of these otherworldly beings, and it's almost unreal and it's almost real and you can't tell. And so you like that kind of fine line and how it feels almost like it could be real to you. And to me, I enjoy perspectives of like the Dragnoth or whatever of these. I would be more interested in of a different perspective. I don't this narrative perspective is not as appealing to me personally in the stories. So I think that that is part of it is that yeah, like so I think that I don't know how to explain it in a way where I'm not like white guy terrible.
Oh gosh.
You know what I mean? Like I'm trying to explain it where because like I just I I am not that interested
You
in.
don't like the narrative perspective of the main of usually the narrator. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I just feel like I find it a little bit boring, and I feel like I have seen an overwhelming amount of things from this type of perspective. And so I find it less interesting because I've already seen so many things from this type of
Well,
perspective. And
it's
so to me, it's less interesting. And like I find perspectives that are like, for example, if we had these otherworldly beings that were from a society different from ours, seeing a perspective from a pet of theirs would be interesting to me. Seeing a perspective of these different things, being in a mind that is alien would be more interesting to me than seeing alien beings from a mind that I am very familiar with, but is not one that agrees with my
Well,
own.
I think the reason I also like these two is it's kind of like a yeah, because these were made out before noir was really a thing, right? And it kind of has that noir feel, but in a bigger scope, right? Where it's somebody investigating some sort of mystery, or
Mm.
and there's a bigger picture, and as they start to unravel the picture, right? The mystery, the kind of folds start coming back, and you understand what's going on. That's kind of summarize how why I like it. But with that, um, I'm gonna
And which
say,
so you recommend Cthulhu for entry level beginners. Which
yeah.
is your favorite Lovecraft story?
I would say Call of Cthulhu. It's just kind of personally
Okay.
really interesting to me, and I read it on a boat at sea,
Oh.
so it's extra kind of
Oh, I see. Okay, this the context of where you read it actually makes so much more like that changes a lot of things to me. All
so
right.
it's personally a little bit more interesting and fun, right?
It feels more like relevant almost. Like to read that when you're on your own adventure, it feels like the I can imagine reading this when the air is crisp and the water is rocking and you're like on your own experience of this reading a story of somebody else on their own experience versus like
Sorry,
me in my cozy bed
sorry.
being like what is this? Like those are very different relatability aspects.
Got it.
But okay.
All right.
So
Well, with that, thank you guys for coming out and listening to our podcast.
have you guys listened to Call of Cthulhu? What did you guys think of these three stories? Which one is your guys' favorite? And make sure to have good discussions. And please comment and tell you what you guys thought.
Thanks for stopping by. Bye.
Thanks for listening. Bye.